Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. I was almost out of money when I found the diner. I had been driving across Montana looking for seasonal work. After the small machine shop I worked at shut down without much warning. They gave everyone a final paycheck on a Friday afternoon and locked the doors before Monday morning. I spent the next 2 weeks sleeping in cheap motels whenever I could afford them and in my truck whenever I could not. By the time I reached the northern part of the state, I had less than $100 left in my checking account and barely enough gas to keep driving another day. I stopped at a weathered diner sitting beside a lonely stretch of highway because I needed coffee more than anything else. There were no other businesses nearby, no gas station, no motel, no houses that I could see, just open fields, distant mountains, and miles of empty road disappearing into the darkness. The sign above the building flickered every few seconds, but the parking lot was surprisingly busy for such an isolated place. Most of the vehicles belonged to truck drivers, with a few pickup trucks parked near the entrance. Inside, the place looked older than the outside suggested. The booths had cracked red vinyl seats, the counter had probably been there for 40 years, and an old jukebox stood quietly in the corner beside a faded cigarette machine that no longer worked. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with grilled onions and bacon grease reminded me of diners my father used to take me to when I was a kid. There were only 3 people working. An older waitress who looked like she had been there forever, a cook wearing a stained white apron, and a heavyset man behind the register counting receipts. I ordered coffee and a cheeseburger because it was one of the cheapest meals on the menu. While I waited, I noticed a handwritten sign taped beside the register. Night shift help wanted. Reliable transportation required. I finished eating before walking over to ask about it. The man behind the register introduced himself as Dale. He looked me up and down for a few seconds before asking whether I had ever worked in food service. I told him I had spent one summer washing dishes in high school and another year stocking shelves at a grocery store. He shrugged as though that was good enough. He explained that finding reliable people willing to work nights out there was nearly impossible. Most applicants quit after a few shifts because they got tired of the drive or decided the hours were not worth it. The pay was better than I expected. Not enough to make anyone rich, but enough to keep my bills paid until I found something permanent. I accepted before he even finished explaining the schedule. Dale nodded once and told me to come back the following evening a little before 10. When I arrived the next night, the parking lot was already beginning to empty. Truck drivers came through in waves, usually before midnight, leaving the diner almost silent for the rest of the night. Dale walked me around the building and showed me where everything was kept. The kitchen was small but organized. Coffee was brewed fresh every hour, whether anyone ordered it or not. The pie display had to stay stocked until sunrise. Every table had to be wiped down after each customer left. None of it seemed unusual. After we finished the tour, he reached beneath the cash register and pulled out a laminated card about the size of a postcard. It was clean despite looking old around the edges. He slid it across the counter toward me without saying a word. I expected another checklist about food safety or cleaning duties. Instead, I found 6 short rules printed in plain black letters. Night shift rules. If a customer walks in after 2:30 in the morning and orders only black coffee, serve it immediately. Never ask where they are coming from. Never clear table 7 until the customer leaves, even if it appears empty. If the jukebox starts playing by itself after midnight, turn the kitchen radio up and keep working. Do not look toward the dining room until the song ends. If someone knocks on the front door after closing time, check the parking lot before unlocking it. If there is not a vehicle outside, do not open the door. If the neon open sign turns on by itself after you have switched it off, do not turn around. Finish what you are doing and wait for the lights to go out again. If every seat in the diner is occupied but no cars are parked outside, lock yourself inside the kitchen until sunrise. Whatever happens, do not step into the dining room. I looked up from the card expecting Dale to smile. He never did. I asked whether the rules were supposed to scare new employees. He simply folded the towel he had been holding and placed it beneath the register. He told me to keep the card in my pocket every night I worked there. I asked why. He answered that nobody lasted long after they stopped carrying it. Before I could ask another question, the waitress walked over carrying a tray of dirty dishes. She glanced at the card in my hand, then quietly looked away without saying anything. Nobody laughed. Nobody acted like it was some joke for the new guy. I slipped the card into my wallet because arguing about it seemed pointless. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Dale showed me how to refill the coffee station, clean the grill, and work the old cash register whenever the waitress was busy. Around 1 in the morning, the last truck driver paid his bill and headed back onto the highway. The diner became strangely quiet after that. I could hear the refrigerators humming in the kitchen and the wind pushing against the windows outside. I noticed something else. Table 7 remained perfectly clean even though nobody had sat there all night. Every other table had ketchup bottles, sugar packets, or coffee mugs that needed attention. Table 7 looked untouched. Without thinking much about it, I grabbed a damp towel and started walking toward it. I had taken only 2 steps before the waitress called my name from behind the counter. She did not sound angry. She sounded worried. She asked me where I was going. I pointed at the empty booth and said I was just wiping it down before the next customer came in. She looked at the booth for several long seconds before turning back toward me. Then she quietly asked if I had already forgotten the card Dale gave me. I looked down at the towel still hanging from my hand. For the first time that night, I remembered the second rule. Never clear table 7 until the customer leaves, even if it appears empty. I laughed a little because the booth was obviously vacant. When I looked back toward table 7, there was a fresh cup of black coffee sitting in the middle of the table. I was certain it had not been there a second earlier. I stood there staring at the fresh cup of black coffee for several seconds before looking back toward the waitress. She was already carrying another stack of clean plates into the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened. I looked around the diner expecting to find someone sitting nearby, but every booth was empty. The front door had not opened. The bell above it never rang. I even walked to the front windows and checked the parking lot. The same 3 vehicles were still outside: Dale's pickup, the waitress's sedan, and my truck. Nothing else. When I turned back toward table 7, the coffee was still there. Steam slowly drifted from the top of the cup, as though someone had poured it only moments earlier. I asked Dale if he had brought it over while I was looking outside. He glanced toward the booth without much interest and simply asked whether I had wiped the table. I told him I had not. He nodded once and said good, then walked back into the kitchen. Nobody seemed interested in explaining where the coffee came from. I decided there had to be a simple answer. Maybe the waitress had set it down without me noticing. Maybe one of the truck drivers had forgotten it before leaving. It was strange, but it did not feel impossible. I finished cleaning the rest of the dining room and tried not to think about it anymore. The next few nights settled into a routine that was almost relaxing. The diner stayed busy until around midnight. Truck drivers came through in groups, ordered burgers, pancakes, or coffee, talked for 20 minutes, then disappeared back onto the highway. After 1 in the morning, the place became almost silent. The sound of tires on the highway grew farther apart, until sometimes 10 or 15 minutes passed without seeing another vehicle. I actually started enjoying the quiet. I would refill the coffee pots, wipe down the counter, wash dishes, and listen to the kitchen radio playing old country songs. Every shift ended just after sunrise. The paychecks arrived on time, the tips were decent, and for the first time in weeks I stopped worrying about money every time I used my debit card. I almost convinced myself the laminated card was nothing more than a tradition the night employees passed down to new hires. Then the first rule finally caught up with me. I was refilling sugar containers behind the counter when the bell above the front door rang once. I looked at the clock hanging over the pie display. 2:37 in the morning. The man who walked inside wore a dark brown jacket covered with rainwater even though it had not rained since sunset. He looked to be somewhere in his late 60s. Gray hair, clean shave, heavy work boots coated with mud. He did not stop to read the menu. He did not look around the diner. He walked directly to table 7 and sat down facing the front windows. I picked up a menu anyway and carried it over. Before I could hand it to him, he quietly said black coffee. Nothing else. His voice sounded tired more than anything. I remembered the first rule before I even reached for my notepad. If a customer walks in after 2:30 in the morning and orders only black coffee, serve it immediately. Never ask where they are coming from. I poured a fresh cup and carried it back without saying another word. He thanked me with a small nod and wrapped both hands around the mug without taking a drink. Something about him made me want to ask if he was all right. Instead, I walked back behind the counter. The waitress leaned close enough that only I could hear her. She asked whether he ordered anything besides coffee. I shook my head. She quietly told me I had done the right thing. Neither of us looked toward table 7 again for several minutes. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced across the dining room expecting to see him drinking his coffee. The booth was empty. The cup was gone. There was no sound of the front door opening. No bell, no footsteps. I hurried outside thinking maybe he had left while I was stocking supplies. The parking lot was completely empty except for our 3 vehicles. There were no headlights disappearing down the highway. No footprints in the gravel leading away from the building. Just cold air and complete silence. I walked back inside and asked Dale if the customer had already paid. He looked confused for a second before opening the register. Inside was a single $5 bill folded neatly beside the receipt printer. He handed it to me without a word. The bill was dry even though the man's jacket had been soaked when he walked in. I checked the security camera above the entrance after we closed that morning. I expected to watch the old man walk through the front door, just like I remembered. The recording showed the bell moving by itself. The front door opened, then closed. Nobody walked inside. A few seconds later, I appeared on camera carrying a mug of coffee toward table 7 and setting it down in front of an empty booth. I watched the footage 3 more times hoping I had missed something. I never did. I looked over at Dale. He reached over the counter and switched the monitor off before I could replay it again. Then he asked whether I still had the laminated card. I told him it was in my wallet. He said to keep it there. He also said something that stayed with me the entire drive home. He told me the rules were not there to explain anything. They were there to help us finish our shifts. I did not know what he meant then. But before long I realized finishing a shift and understanding what was happening were 2 completely different things. I stopped watching the security footage after that night because I realized it never made me feel any better. Every time something strange happened, I expected the cameras to give me a reasonable explanation. They never did. Sometimes they showed less than I remembered. Sometimes they showed things I never noticed while they were happening. After a while, I decided it was easier to trust what I saw with my own eyes than whatever the cameras decided to record. Work settled into another routine. The lunch crowd disappeared before midnight. Truck drivers came through until 1 or 2 in the morning. Then the highway grew quiet again. I found myself remembering customers without even trying. There was an older rancher who ordered meatloaf every Thursday, a young couple traveling across the state in an old camper, and a truck driver named Frank who always left exactly $3 on the table no matter what he ordered. Those people made the place feel normal. They reminded me that despite the strange rules, most nights were still just nights. I almost started believing the odd things only happened once in a while. Then the jukebox played for the first time. I was stacking clean coffee mugs behind the counter when the music started without warning. The diner had been completely silent only a second earlier. An old country song echoed through the dining room from the dusty jukebox in the corner. I nearly dropped the mug in my hand because I knew nobody had gone anywhere near it. The waitress froze beside the pie display. Dale looked up from the register. Neither of them seemed surprised. They looked tired instead, almost disappointed. Dale pointed toward the small radio sitting on a shelf inside the kitchen. I remembered the 3rd rule immediately. If the jukebox starts playing by itself after midnight, turn the kitchen radio up and keep working. Do not look toward the dining room until the song ends. I walked into the kitchen, switched on the radio, and turned the volume high enough to drown out most of the music coming from the dining room. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I kept washing dishes because standing still somehow felt worse. Every few seconds I caught myself wanting to peek around the kitchen doorway just to prove nothing unusual was happening. Curiosity is a hard habit to break. I understood why the rule existed. The less I knew, the easier it was to keep working. The song seemed to last forever. The radio played advertisements, weather reports, and 2 different songs before the jukebox finally went silent. Only then did Dale lower the radio. Nobody spoke for several moments. Eventually, the waitress walked into the dining room carrying a coffee pot as though she expected someone to be waiting. When she came back, her face looked pale. I asked whether everything was all right. She hesitated before answering. She quietly said there had been 6 coffee cups on table 7 that were not there before. I asked where they had gone. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Then she said she had never touched them. I walked over to table 7 after she returned to the counter. The booth was perfectly clean. Not a single cup. Not a stain. Nothing that suggested anyone had been sitting there. I did not ask another question. 2 nights later, another rule nearly caught me by surprise. We officially closed at 3 in the morning. But employees stayed another hour cleaning the kitchen and preparing for breakfast. The front door remained locked once the open sign was switched off. I was sweeping near the entrance when someone knocked 3 slow times against the glass. The sound echoed through the empty diner. I looked outside automatically. I could make out the shape of a man standing just beyond the porch light. Instinct told me to unlock the door. It was cold outside, and the nearest town was miles away. Before I reached the handle, I remembered the 4th rule. If someone knocks on the front door after closing time, check the parking lot before unlocking it. If there is not a vehicle outside, do not open the door. I stepped sideways until I could see the entire parking lot through the front windows. Every parking space was empty except for our own vehicles. There was no pickup, no sedan, no motorcycle, nothing that could have brought the man there. I slowly backed away from the door. The knocking stopped immediately. I stayed where I was for almost a minute before looking outside again. The porch was empty. There was nobody standing there anymore. The snow around the entrance had no footprints leading toward the road. I felt something tighten in my stomach that stayed there for the rest of the shift. When dawn finally arrived, I found Dale outside, unlocking the dumpster gate. I asked him if he had ever opened the door after closing. He stopped what he was doing and stared toward the highway instead of looking at me. After a long silence, he admitted he had done it once, many years earlier. I asked what happened. He shook his head and quietly said, he still locked the front door every night because of it. That was the only answer he gave. From that point on, I stopped thinking of the laminated card as a collection of strange rules. I started thinking of it as instructions written by someone who had already made every mistake I was about to make. I carried it in my wallet every night without fail, and for the first time since taking the job, I caught myself checking the clock whenever the diner became too quiet. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something waiting for its turn. I started paying attention to little things I would have ignored during my first week. I noticed the waitress always looked at the parking lot before unlocking the front door at the beginning of every shift. I noticed Dale check the neon open sign twice before turning it off each morning, even though it never failed during business hours. I also noticed nobody ever sat customers at table 7 unless every other booth in the diner was occupied. I wanted to ask why, but every time I thought about bringing it up, I remembered how every previous question had ended. Nobody refused to answer me. They simply answered in ways that made me wish I had never asked. After a while, I stopped looking for explanations and concentrated on doing my job. The nights grew colder as autumn slowly turned toward winter. Fewer tourists came through the area, leaving mostly truck drivers and locals who already knew everyone working behind the counter. I learned most of their names. They joked with Dale, complained about the weather, drank too much coffee, and disappeared back onto the highway before daylight. Those customers made the diner feel almost normal. The strange part was that none of them ever chose table 7. Even when the diner became crowded, they preferred waiting for another booth to open instead of sitting there. I doubted most of them even realized they were doing it. It simply happened every single night. One shift ended later than usual because a delivery truck arrived nearly an hour behind schedule. By the time we finished unloading supplies and cleaning the kitchen, the sky outside was still completely dark. I walked over to the front windows while Dale counted the register for the night. The neon open sign had been switched off almost 30 minutes earlier. I remembered watching Dale unplug it himself before locking the front door. While I stood there looking out at the empty highway, a faint red glow suddenly reflected across the glass. I turned my eyes toward the entrance. The open sign was glowing again. The word looked perfectly normal, bright red against the darkness outside, as though we had never closed. My first instinct was to tell Dale. Then the fifth rule came back to me. If the neon open sign turns on by itself after you have switched it off, do not turn around. Finish what you are doing and wait for the lights to go out again. I realized I had already made one mistake. I had looked directly at the sign. I forced myself to keep facing the front windows. Behind me, I could hear dishes clinking softly in the kitchen. Someone walked across the wooden floor with slow, steady footsteps. I assumed it was Dale until I remembered he had been standing beside the register counting receipts only a few seconds earlier. The footsteps continued behind me, never rushing, never stopping. They sounded close enough that whoever was making them should have been standing beside me. I stared through the front window instead. Outside, the highway remained empty. Wind pushed loose snow across the parking lot in long white lines. I heard the front door bell ring once behind me, then twice, then 3 more times. Each ring sounded exactly like someone entering the diner. I knew better than to look. Every muscle in my neck wanted to turn around anyway. The silence that followed somehow felt worse than the footsteps. After several long seconds, the red reflection on the glass slowly disappeared. I counted to 10 before turning around. The open sign was dark again. Dale stood behind the register exactly where I remembered leaving him. The waitress was wiping down the coffee station. Neither of them appeared to have moved. I asked if either of them had walked across the dining room a moment earlier. Both shook their heads without looking up. Nobody mentioned hearing the front door bell. I decided not to mention it either. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. Before climbing into my truck, I glanced back through the front windows. Table 7 now held 3 fresh cups of black coffee. Every other table remained empty. I blinked once and the cups were gone. I drove home telling myself I had imagined them because I was tired. The following week gave me no chance to convince myself everything had been in my head. Business stayed unusually slow because a snowstorm had closed several mountain roads. By 2 in the morning, only one truck driver remained inside the diner. He finished his pie, paid his bill, and left without saying much. I watched his headlights disappear into the darkness until they were completely gone. Not even 5 minutes later, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks, exactly the same rhythm as before. This time, I did not move toward the entrance. Neither did anyone else. Dale quietly continued washing coffee pots while the waitress finished counting tips behind the counter. The knocking came again. Then a voice called through the glass. It sounded calm, almost friendly. It asked if anyone was still open because the weather was getting worse. I looked toward the parking lot through the side window. There were no headlights, no truck, no tire tracks leading to the diner. Only fresh snow covering the entire lot. Whoever stood outside had apparently arrived without leaving a single mark behind. I backed away from the door until I reached the kitchen entrance. The knocking continued for nearly 2 minutes before stopping as suddenly as it had started. None of us spoke until another 10 minutes had passed. Finally, Dale looked at me and quietly said, "I was learning faster than most people did." I asked how many people had worked nights there before me. He stared at the coffee pot in his hands for several seconds before answering. More than I could count. I asked how many still did. He looked around the empty diner before saying only 3. I did not ask another question. For the first time since taking the job, I realized the help wanted sign was still hanging beside the register exactly where I had first seen it. Somehow, I had never noticed that it was never taken down. I stopped thinking about quitting after the first month because the job had become part of my life in a strange way. Every night followed the same routine until it suddenly did not. I knew when the truck drivers usually arrived, which regulars wanted refills before asking, and exactly how long it took the grill to heat up after we opened. The ordinary parts of the job became comforting because they reminded me there was still something normal left inside that diner. What bothered me was how naturally the 6 rules had become part of my routine. I no longer carried the laminated card because I needed to remember them. I carried it because leaving it at home somehow felt wrong. There were nights when I caught myself checking that it was still inside my wallet before even walking through the front door. I never admitted that to anyone. One evening, a heavy snowstorm rolled across the highway earlier than expected. The weather forecast had mentioned light snow, but by midnight the wind was pushing thick white sheets across the parking lot hard enough that I could barely see the road from the front windows. Only 2 customers came in after 11. Both were truck drivers trying to wait out the weather before continuing west. They stayed longer than usual, drinking cup after cup of coffee while listening to the weather reports on the kitchen radio. Shortly after 1 in the morning, they finally decided to leave together. I watched their headlights disappear into the storm until the snow swallowed them completely. After that, the diner became quieter than I had ever heard it. Even the refrigerators seemed softer somehow. I was wiping down the counter when the jukebox suddenly clicked. Every light inside it came on at once. For a brief second, I hoped someone had accidentally bumped into the power switch. Then the first notes of an old song drifted through the empty dining room. I recognized it immediately because it had played a few weeks earlier. Dale reached over without saying a word and turned the kitchen radio up until static and country music filled the back of the diner. I lowered my head and continued drying dishes. This time, curiosity felt even stronger than before. I already knew what would happen if I looked. Somehow knowing made it harder not to. I focused on counting plates instead. 1, 2, 3, 4. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doorway, I heard chairs scraping slowly across the floor. Then another chair. Then another. It sounded as though someone was pulling every chair in the diner away from its table one at a time. I kept counting dishes. 5, 6, 7. The song continued playing. I noticed something else. Mixed beneath the music was the faint sound of people talking. I could not understand the words. There were too many voices speaking at once. Sometimes one voice became clearer than the others before disappearing again beneath the music. They almost sounded like conversations taking place in another room. I looked at Dale. He kept his eyes fixed on the sink while washing the same frying pan over and over again. I realized he could hear them too. The waitress quietly closed the kitchen door without looking toward the dining room. Nobody spoke. Nobody acknowledged what we were hearing. Eventually, the music stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The voices disappeared with it. Dale lowered the radio volume and nodded toward the dining room. We walked out together. Every chair stood perfectly where it had been before. Nothing appeared out of place except table 7. 6 fresh cups of black coffee sat neatly arranged across the tabletop. Each cup was still steaming. I stared at them long enough to convince myself they were real this time. The waitress slowly backed away from the booth. Nobody touched the cups. After nearly a minute, they simply were not there anymore. There was no sound, no movement. One moment they existed, the next the table was empty again. I rubbed my eyes because I honestly believed I was losing my mind. Dale quietly told me to lock the front door even though we had already closed an hour earlier. While I slid the deadbolt into place, I noticed the open sign was still dark. I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding. Then someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. I froze before reaching the curtain covering the window beside the entrance. The knocking came again. I remembered the 4th rule immediately. Check the parking lot first. I carefully pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. Snow covered everything. Our 3 vehicles remained exactly where we had parked them. There was nobody standing on the porch. I looked farther across the parking lot. Nothing. No headlights. No footprints. No tire tracks. Another knock sounded directly against the glass, loud enough to make me jump backward. Whatever had made the sound was standing only inches away from me. I forced myself not to unlock the door. After several seconds, the knocking stopped. I waited another full minute before looking outside again. Nothing had changed. When I turned around, the waitress was staring toward the front windows with an expression I could not read. She quietly asked whether I had seen a truck. I told her there had not been one. She nodded as though that confirmed something she already knew. Before sunrise, the storm finally began to clear. Pale light slowly pushed away the darkness outside, making the diner feel ordinary again. I grabbed a broom and started sweeping near the booths. As I reached table 7, I noticed something lying beneath the edge of the seat. I bent down and picked it up. It was a small metal key attached to a faded plastic tag. Stamped across the tag in worn white letters was a single number, 7. I walked over to Dale and asked if one of the customers had dropped it earlier. The moment he saw the key, his face changed. He took it from my hand so quickly that I barely had time to let go. Without saying a word, he carried it into the kitchen, opened the old wood stove we used during the winter, and threw the key into the fire. I watched the plastic tag curl and blacken as the flames swallowed it. I asked him why he had burned it. He stood there watching the fire until nothing remained except a small piece of twisted metal. Then he quietly answered with the shortest sentence I had heard since meeting him. "Because nobody ever comes back for that key." The strange part was not what he said. The strange part was that for the first time since I started working there, Dale sounded genuinely afraid. I could not stop thinking about the key after Dale threw it into the stove. The image stayed with me during the drive home and followed me into my sleep. It was not the key itself that bothered me. It was the way Dale reacted. Until then, he had always looked calm no matter what happened inside the diner. Whether someone ordered black coffee after 2:30 in the morning or the jukebox played by itself, he handled everything the same way someone might deal with a leaking faucet. The key was different. For the first time, I had seen real fear on his face, and that frightened me more than anything else I had experienced since taking the job. I almost asked him about it the following evening, but the words never came out. He looked exhausted before the shift even started. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he spent more time staring out the front windows than counting receipts. The waitress noticed it too, but never said anything. We all pretended everything was normal, because pretending had somehow become part of working there. Business remained slow. Another storm had moved into the mountains, keeping most travelers off the highway. Only a handful of locals stopped in before midnight. Then the diner settled into its usual silence. I refilled the coffee station while listening to the weather report on the kitchen radio. Freezing temperatures, blowing snow, poor visibility, the kind of forecast that usually meant a long, quiet night. Shortly after 1 in the morning, the telephone behind the register rang. That alone felt unusual because almost nobody called the diner that late. Dale answered on the second ring. He listened without saying a word for nearly 30 seconds before quietly replying that we were still open. Then he hung up. I asked who it was. He looked at the receiver for a moment before placing it back on the cradle. Then he simply said nobody. I laughed because I thought he was trying to avoid the question. Nobody else smiled. The waitress slowly turned the open sign around so the dark side faced the highway, even though we still had 2 hours before closing. I looked toward the front windows. Outside, the parking lot was completely empty except for our own vehicles, buried beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. Sometime after 2, the lights flickered once. Every fluorescent bulb in the diner dimmed, just enough for me to notice before returning to normal. I assumed the weather had affected the power lines. Then they flickered again. This time, they stayed dim for several long seconds. I glanced toward the jukebox expecting another song to begin, but it remained dark. The silence somehow felt worse. I carried a fresh pot of coffee toward the dining room and stopped halfway across the floor. Every booth was occupied. Men and women sat quietly throughout the diner with cups of coffee resting in front of them. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at each other. They simply sat there facing different directions. I almost dropped the coffee pot before remembering the 6th rule. If every seat in the diner is occupied but no cars are parked outside, lock yourself inside the kitchen until sunrise. Whatever happens, do not step into the dining room. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slowly backed away without taking my eyes off the dining room. None of the customers moved. Not one of them looked toward me. They might have been statues if not for the faint steam rising from dozens of coffee cups spread across the tables. I reached the kitchen doorway and called for Dale. He appeared immediately as though he had already known what I was going to say. The moment he looked into the dining room, he quietly shut the kitchen door and locked it. The waitress turned off every light in the kitchen except the one above the sink. Nobody spoke. We stood there listening. At first I heard nothing except the refrigerator compressor humming in the corner. Then chairs began sliding slowly across the floor outside, one after another, followed by the soft sound of coffee cups being placed on tabletops. After that came footsteps, dozens of them, moving through the dining room at a calm, steady pace. None of them approached the kitchen door. They simply wandered through the diner as though searching for something. I checked my watch. It was only 2:23. Sunrise was still hours away. The footsteps continued. Every now and then one stopped just outside the kitchen door. I could hear nothing beyond the wood except complete silence before the footsteps started again. The waitress quietly sat down on an overturned milk crate and closed her eyes. She looked like someone waiting for a storm to pass. Dale stared at the floor without moving. I wanted to ask how often this happened, but something told me talking was a bad idea. Nearly an hour passed before another sound finally broke the silence. 3 slow knocks landed against the kitchen door. Nobody reacted. Then a familiar voice calmly spoke my name from the other side. It sounded exactly like my younger brother. I had not spoken to him in almost a month. He lived nearly 500 miles away and had never visited the diner. The voice asked if I was all right. It sounded worried. Then it asked me to unlock the door because it was freezing outside. Every instinct told me to answer. Before I could move, Dale quietly placed his hand on my shoulder and slowly shook his head. I stayed where I was. The voice called my name 2 more times before fading into silence. A few minutes later, another voice replaced it. This one belonged to my father, who had died 6 years earlier. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. I knew it could not possibly be him, yet the voice sounded so familiar that my eyes filled with tears before I even realized what was happening. It asked me to open the door. It said we needed to talk. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood, just to stop myself from reaching for the handle. Eventually, the voices disappeared altogether. The footsteps stopped. The chairs became silent. When pale morning light finally pushed through the front windows, Dale unlocked the kitchen door without saying a word. The dining room was empty. Every chair stood neatly beneath its table. Every coffee cup had been washed and returned to the shelves. Only one thing looked different. Table 7 held a single laminated card lying perfectly in the center of the booth. I slowly walked over and picked it up. It looked exactly like the one I carried in my wallet. I turned it over expecting to find the same 6 rules. Instead, the back contained one sentence that had never been there before. If they ever know your name, it is already too late. I did not tell Dale about the sentence on the back of the laminated card right away. I slipped it into my apron pocket and spent the rest of the morning pretending nothing had happened. When my shift finally ended, I compared it with the card inside my wallet before driving home. The one I had been given on my first night still contained only the 6 rules. The second card had the same rules on the front, but the warning remained printed across the back exactly as I remembered it. If they ever know your name, it is already too late. The words looked as though they had always been there. The ink was not faded or scratched. It was impossible to convince myself someone had added it recently. I considered throwing the second card away, but every time I reached for the trash can something stopped me. Instead, I placed it inside the glove compartment of my truck and tried not to think about it. The following night felt different before I even walked through the front door. The highway was unusually busy because the weather had finally cleared, yet almost every vehicle that passed continued driving without stopping. The diner looked exactly the same from outside, but I noticed the open sign was already glowing even though we had not unlocked the doors yet. Dale stood inside staring at it through the front window. He unplugged the sign, waited a few seconds, then plugged it back in. The light stayed on. He sighed quietly before unlocking the entrance and telling me to get the coffee started. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. Customers arrived steadily until midnight. Most of them were truck drivers trying to make up for lost time after the storms. The familiar rhythm of taking orders, pouring coffee, and cleaning tables almost convinced me everything had returned to normal. I even caught myself laughing at one of the regular customers complaining about the price of pie. For nearly 2 hours, the diner felt like an ordinary roadside restaurant again. Then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Every customer sitting inside had chosen a booth other than table 7. The booth remained perfectly clean and completely empty despite every other table being occupied. Eventually, one truck driver carrying a tray looked around for a place to sit. Without thinking, he started walking toward table 7. Before I could say anything, he suddenly stopped halfway there. He looked at the empty booth for several seconds with a confused expression, then quietly turned around and sat at the counter instead. Nobody told him to do it. He simply changed his mind. I looked toward Dale. He had noticed it too. He slowly nodded as though something he expected had finally happened. Shortly after 2:30, the last customer paid his bill and left. I watched his pickup disappear down the highway until the taillights vanished into the darkness. The parking lot became empty once again. I locked the front door and began wiping down the counter. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the bell above the entrance rang. I looked up automatically. The front door had not moved. Nobody stood outside. The bell rang again. This time I realized the sound was coming from somewhere deeper inside the diner. Another bell answered it from farther away. Then another. I turned slowly toward the dining room. Every empty coffee cup resting on the tables began vibrating just enough for their spoons to rattle softly against the ceramic. The sound spread through the diner until it resembled dozens of tiny bells ringing together. Dale immediately switched on the kitchen radio even though the jukebox remained silent. Static filled the room. The waitress quietly stepped backward into the kitchen without taking her eyes off table 7. I followed her. Before reaching the doorway, I glanced toward the empty booth one last time. Someone was sitting there. I could not describe the person afterward because every detail slipped away the moment I looked elsewhere. I only remembered the feeling that whoever occupied the booth had been sitting there all night, and I had somehow failed to notice. The figure slowly raised one hand from the tabletop. Then it pointed directly at me. I looked away immediately and hurried into the kitchen. Nobody spoke. We remained there listening to the soft ringing of coffee cups for what felt like an hour. Eventually the sound faded. When we returned to the dining room, every cup sat perfectly still. Table 7 was empty again. I wanted to believe my imagination had gotten the better of me, until I noticed something scratched into the wooden surface of the booth. There had never been any writing there before. My name had been carved into the table in rough, uneven letters. Fresh wood dust still rested inside the grooves. I instinctively reached out to touch it, but Dale caught my wrist before my fingers reached the surface. He quietly pulled me away from the booth and handed me a bottle of furniture polish. He told me to clean every other table in the diner except that one. I asked who had carved my name there. He answered with another question. Had anyone inside the diner called you by your first name tonight? I thought back through the entire shift. The waitress had only called me kid like she always did. Dale usually said son or pointed instead of speaking. None of the customers had known my name. Then I remembered the voice outside the kitchen door the previous night. It had spoken my name over and over again. I felt the blood drain from my face. Dale did not need to explain anything. He simply looked toward the laminated card sticking out of my apron pocket. I understood what he was trying to tell me. Before sunrise, we prepared to leave as usual. I grabbed my jacket and switched off the lights one section at a time. When I reached the front entrance, I glanced through the windows toward the empty parking lot. Dozens of vehicles sat outside beneath the pale morning sky. Pickup trucks, old sedans, motorcycles, tractor trailers. Every parking space was full. I blinked once and they were gone. Only our 3 vehicles remained. I unlocked the door with a hand that would not stop shaking. As I stepped outside, I heard the jukebox begin playing behind me, even though every light inside the diner had already been turned off. I did not look back. I climbed into my truck and drove away. Halfway home, I reached into my pocket to make sure the laminated card was still there. Instead, my fingers touched something cold and made of metal. I pulled it out at the next stop sign. Resting in my palm was another small key attached to a faded plastic tag. This one did not have the number 7 on it. It had my name. I almost turned the truck around 3 different times before I finally drove home with the key still sitting in my pocket. Every part of me wanted to throw it into the nearest river or leave it on the side of the highway, but I never did. I kept remembering the way Dale had burned the first key without saying a word. If that key had frightened him, then carrying this one home probably made me the biggest fool in Montana. I slept for less than 2 hours that day before waking to the sound of rain tapping against my apartment window. The key was lying on the kitchen table where I had left it beside my wallet. I picked it up one last time before leaving for work. My name was still stamped into the faded plastic tag. Nothing else, no number, no company logo, just my name. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and drove toward the diner with a feeling I could not explain. The building came into view long before I reached the parking lot. The open sign was glowing even though my shift had not started yet. Dale was standing outside smoking a cigarette, something I had never seen him do before. He threw it into the gravel as I climbed out of my truck. He looked older than he had the night before, tired enough that I wondered if he had slept at all. He asked whether I had brought the key with me. I nodded. He quietly said he was afraid I would. That was the first honest answer he had given me since I started working there. Inside the diner, the atmosphere felt heavy from the moment we unlocked the doors. The regular customers still came in, ordered food, laughed about the weather, and left like every other night. But nobody stayed very long.
One by one, the booths emptied until only table 7 remained untouched. The waitress barely spoke during the entire shift. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the front windows as though expecting someone to arrive. Shortly after midnight, the wind picked up outside. Rain struck the windows hard enough that I could barely see the highway. The power flickered once, then again. I looked toward the jukebox before it even happened. The lights inside it slowly came to life. A scratchy old country song drifted into the dining room. Dale did not even wait for the first verse. He turned the kitchen radio on full volume. I walked into the kitchen beside him. This time I could hear something beneath the music almost immediately. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Chairs scraped across the floor. Quiet conversations filled the dining room just beyond the doorway. Then came 3 slow knocks against the front door. Nobody moved. Another 3 knocks followed. Then another. Eventually the knocking stopped, but the bell above the entrance rang anyway. Once, twice, 3 times. The waitress closed her eyes. Dale reached into his pocket and placed his own laminated card on the counter beside mine. I noticed something strange. His card looked much older than mine. The edges were cracked. The printing had almost faded away. He looked at me for a long moment before quietly saying that every person who worked the night shift eventually received a key. I asked what the key opened. He slowly shook his head and answered that nobody ever found out, because the ones who tried never came back to tell anyone. Before I could ask another question, every light in the diner went out. Complete darkness filled the room except for the pale red glow of the open sign shining through the kitchen doorway. Nobody spoke. After several seconds, the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red light. I stepped toward the kitchen door before remembering the 6th rule. Then I realized I did not need to look into the dining room to know what was waiting there. I could hear dozens of people breathing quietly beyond the doorway. The sound filled the diner from one wall to the other. Somebody slowly pushed a coffee cup across a table. Another chair moved, then another. A calm, familiar voice called my name from somewhere in the dining room. It sounded exactly like my father again. This time I did not answer. Another voice replaced it, then another. People I had known years earlier. Teachers, old coworkers, my younger brother, all calling my name as though they were only a few feet away. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The voices seemed to come from inside my own head. Then everything became silent. Dale looked at me. He quietly said it was time for me to leave. I stared at him because leaving meant walking through the dining room. He nodded toward the back exit instead. I had completely forgotten the diner even had one. Before opening it, he placed his laminated card into my hand. "Keep yours. I do not need mine anymore." Those were the last words he ever said to me. I stepped outside into the cold rain. Before closing the back door, I looked at Dale one final time. He was standing alone in the kitchen with his back toward me. Then the jukebox became louder. Every light inside the diner suddenly came back on at once. I heard chairs sliding rapidly across the floor, followed by dozens of coffee cups striking tabletops together. I shut the door and ran to my truck. I never looked through the windows. I drove until the diner disappeared in my rearview mirror. I never went back. The following afternoon, I called the diner. Nobody answered. I tried again the next day. The phone had been disconnected. A week later, I drove past during daylight hoping to return my uniforms. The building was locked. The parking lot was empty. A weathered "Help Wanted" sign still hung inside the front window. There was no sign of Dale or the waitress. I asked at the nearest gas station if anyone knew what had happened. The cashier looked confused and told me the diner had been closed for months. I almost argued until I realized there was no point. Nobody would have believed me anyway. I found another job in a different state and tried to move on with my life. Most nights I managed to forget about the diner completely. Then every few months I found myself checking online job listings for no reason I could explain. The advertisement was always there. Night shift help wanted. Reliable transportation required. The phone number changed. The contact name changed. Even the hourly pay changed. Only one thing never did. The photograph. It always showed the same lonely diner beside the same empty highway in Montana. And every time I looked closely at the front window, I could just make out a single booth near the glass. Table 7 was never empty. If you were working that night, would you have followed all 6 rules? Or would you have walked out the moment table 7 wasn't empty anymore? Let me know in the comments.